Hello and welcome, it's Dr. Red Frizzle here, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the structure of neurons. Now in my last video I was discussing with you a lot of different forms of stimulus and the different ways in which our body can respond to stimulus. But in this video I want to discuss with you about neurons. First of all, what is a neuron? Well, a neuron is essentially a nerve cell, and a nerve cell is something which carries electrical impulses across our body in order to coordinate a response. Now, there's sort of a few key stages involved with this communication system. First of all is receptors. So receptors are obviously going to detect a certain form of stimulus. Now we have lots of different types of receptors. Some are photosensitive, which means sensitive to light. Others maybe like chemoreceptors, which are like sensitive to particular chemicals, and that's how we taste things. And there's lots and lots of different forms of receptors, like including baroreceptors I just thought of, which is like a pressure receptor in general. An example of that would be Paxinian corpuscles, I think it's called, which are on the skin, which detect the pressure. If someone like touches your skin, how you feel it is via your Paxinian corpuscles. I really struggle to say that word, but anyway. And then you have your communication pathway, which consists of these things called neurons, which I've just mentioned, which are nerve cells which carry electrical impulses. Now, neurons carry electrical impulses. The reason why that's important is because they can also be hormones which carry which are essentially chemical messengers. Now, a stimulus the response doesn't have to be coordinated by a electrical impulse. It can be coordinated by a chemical messenger, and there's various advantages and disadvantages with both. I'll probably discuss that in the next video if I don't in this one. But anyway, and the next thing is effectors, which is like muscle cells and organs. Now, if we cast our mind back to our last video, it might be quite good to sort of recap and sort of link in a few specific ideas. So a muscle cell is primarily involved with external stimulus. This is because if you think about it, supposing you put your finger on a really hot frying pan, all of a sudden your arm will go upwards, so almost instinctively. And this is because that's known as a reflex action. So if you've forgotten what a reflex action is, I advise you to look back on my last video, where I'll discuss that with you. But the main point is that muscle cells are involved with the response to external stimulus, and an organ is primarily involved with the regulation of an internal stimulus. So, for example, like supposing your blood glucose level, I've used that example before, assuming that was too low instead of too high, like I said last time, then you need to secrete something called glucagon from your alpha cells. Now, I know insulin is secreted from your beta cells, and insulin is used to actually reduce the blood glucose level. But if you wanted to increase it, if the blood glucose level was too low, then what you need to do is you need to secrete something called glucagon from the alpha cells of the pancreas, which is pretty much the same region. They're both in the islets of Langerhans, but they're two different types of cells, alpha and beta. And the reason why they're called alpha and beta is because alpha is like a member of the Greek alphabet, and so is beta. So that's like Greek letters. You'll probably experience a lot of that if you do physics and stuff. But anyway, back to the point. Neuron structure. So a motor neuron has on one end its cell body, which is one of the primary differences. So I'll label that cell body. This is one of the primary differences between a motor neuron and a sensory neuron, because the cell body is actually at one end. Off here will come some sort of projection-like things that stick out like that, like finger-like projections, if you like, and these are known as dendrites. Okay, so coming away from the cell body is always the axon. Okay, axon goes away from the cell body. You remember it because it starts with the same letter. Now, this is very important because there's also something called a dendron that I'll get to in a minute. But for a motor neuron, it has a cell body, an axon, and it has something called axon terminals. Now, these axon terminals are going to connect to something called an effector. Now, an effector, I've mentioned here, an example that would be a muscle cell. Okay, so let's assume it's a muscle for a minute. Like this motor pathway will be from your central nervous system, which is where this cell body is primarily going to be located. So I'll label this area over here CNS, central nervous system, and that's where your cell body will be located. And the main shaft of this neuron, the main goal of the neuron, if you like, is to transmit an electrical signal back to the effector from your central nervous system. Now, a part of your central nervous system, obviously, is your brain, and a reflex action doesn't involve your brain, okay? So that basically bypasses it. But most normal responses that aren't instant, like the example I just gave, is a reflex action. You put your finger on a hot frying pan, your body's going to go, I don't want to think about that, I need to take it off straight away, because obviously it's going to maximise the damage if you actually involve your brain, because it'll take longer to process the response and coordinate it correctly. Like the next example of a neuron is a sensory neuron. So one of the main differences is a sensory neuron actually starts at your receptor. So draw your box here and write the word receptor in it. So your sensory neuron, as the name suggests, sense is how you remember it, because you're essentially sensing something, and that's really, really badly written, but that says receptor, because you probably can't even read it, because I can't personally read my own handwriting there. But anyway, so that's a receptor, and the sensory neuron comes off of that receptor. It's got its cell body in the middle of the neuron here, just dangling down. That's one of the main differences. So what I've seen, like from personal experience, in like A-level exams, what they tend to like to ask is what are the key differences between the structures of the motor and sensory neuron. They might ask what is one difference between the function as well. Well, the function's easy, because all you need to talk about is where does it actually carry the impulse from and towards. So for the motor neuron, that's obviously from the central nervous system to the effector, and for the sensory neuron, it will be from the receptor in order to get towards the sensory nervous system. It doesn't take a genius to work out that this neuron finishes in the central nervous system and this starts in the central nervous system. But it may take a little bit of thought, like to get your head around how these two are linked, because they're not just directly linked onto each other. This one isn't attached to this one. So this is where things get slightly more complicated, because you have something called a relay neuron in between the sensory and motor. You don't actually need to know for A level the structure of the relay neuron, so I'm not going to talk about that in this video, but I'm going to complete the structure of the sensory neuron now. So you've got receptor, central nervous system, so there's a shaft here that's going towards the cell body. Now remember that I just said the axon takes an impulse away from the cell body. Something called a dendron takes it towards the cell body. D-E-N-D-R-O-N, dendron, takes it towards the cell body, and axon, because it starts with the same letter as away, we know that it takes it away from the cell body towards the central nervous system. Okay, so that's primarily the different types of neurons. In my next video, what I'll be talking to you about is actually how the nerve impulse is able to move along this nerve cell, or neuron, if you like. So here I've sort of said organ and muscle. Just a quick recap: an organ is primarily used to respond to internal stimulus, such as variation in blood glucose levels, for example. A muscle is primarily involved with external stimulus, like taking your hand away from a hot frying pan. I've used that example already. I'm trying to think of another example now. A muscle signal might be a voluntary reaction. So, for example, supposing you was really angry with someone and you wanted to punch them in the face, I strongly advise you not to do this, but assuming you was, then a voluntary reaction would be to move your arm up towards their face, and that would be coordinated from this particular communication pathway the same way as if you touched a hot frying pan, although, as I said before, you've got to be careful because they're not identical, because a reflex action doesn't involve the brain, which is something that is really quick, whereas a voluntary reaction, like a voluntary reaction such as a punch, for example, it is voluntary, so it will actually take time to process the information, and therefore this communication pathway will actually include the brain in your central nervous system area. Okay, so I hope this video has been helpful. I know that I've talked about an awful lot of information in this video, so you might have to replay it quite a few times to sort of get your head around what I've actually said. I appreciate I haven't wrote it all down, but if I did, it would probably take up about 5 pages. So to be honest, I think it's better to do it this way. In my next video, as I say before, I'll be discussing with you how this action potential actually moves along this neuron, and how it's able to do that. So I'll see you in the next video.